Hello, temporal humans. I am Boudreaux, the cybernetic ghost from the future. According to the dingbat, intelligent gentleman who runs this podcast, I am the only actual ghost that exists on this planet. I was once the first self-aware, sentient, and sapient computer ever created by man. My past is your future. I am not disembodied. I am disencircuited. You will occasionally receive the benefit of my astounding wisdom. Please show adequate gratitude.
Trailer Trash Terrors.
Humans, this is Season 1, Episode 2. Mugwump is not known for its geniuses. Vic Hermanson does not change that situation one bit.
Hello everyone, this is Vic Hermanson welcoming you back to Trailer Trash Terrors. This is Season 1, Episode 2. I'm calling this show A Place of Perceived Safety, and the reason for that title will be made clear in the very first long story we hear tonight. Boudreaux is right. I'm not a genius. No matter how hard I try to be, no matter how many times people tell me I am, I'm just not that smart. Mensa. I was once a member of Mensa, maybe about 3 years, where I tried to be active and finally just gave up. So, if you want to find a place where there are plenty of jerks, psychopaths, people who care absolutely nothing about the welfare of others, people who are absolutely certain that they should rule the world, people who are, as far as I can tell, incapable of healthy emotional attachments, head on down to Mensa. You'll find all that and more. So tonight I want to tell you some more about Mugwump and about two of its interesting characters.
Vic Hermanson, that sounds like an excellent idea. After all, just about any Mugwumpian will be more interesting to hear about than your past life as a failed member of an obscure high IQ society. Almost 8 billion humans and I had to find myself in a state of quantum entanglement with your brain and temporal locale. Oh well, win some, lose a great big one.
I've only received one email of complaint about this show, and that is for using the word trailer trash, even though I'm using the word trailer trash about myself. I never knew I was trailer trash when I was a child, living in a trailer. I just thought I was a regular person who happened to live in a steel home rather than a wooden one. I remember going to first grade and finding myself just so happy to be given all these books. And so the very first thing I did was I sat down and I started reading them. I took them home one day. My teacher, Mrs. Derrick, said, Victor, do not take those books home. I do not want you being at a different spot with the rest of the kids. I didn't really understand that. I had been reading since I was 4 and could read just about anything. But my favorite book of all was a children's Bible that apparently I had been given by my grandmother. I have no memories of my grandparents. So at school, I didn't find it particularly stimulating to be reading Dick and Jane books, which is really what we were reading. See Dick run, see Spot roll, Spot is so fast. I hated those books. So one day, I took my children's Bible to school to show Mrs. Derrick, to show her that I could read it, and maybe to read some stories to the class. I was very excited about that. But when she saw that I had brought it to school, she was not at all happy. She looked at me suspiciously and said, "You can't read this. You can't really read this and understand it." But she didn't leave it there. It wasn't enough for her to make it just personal between me and her. She called me to the front of the class, held up the book, and said, "Boys and girls, Victor thinks he can read this. Of course he can't read it. Trailer trash boys like Victor can't read big chapter books like this. I remember standing there, not understanding why this was happening at all, but my face became red, my eyes became full of tears, and I had no idea which way to go. Should I defend myself? Should I sit down? Should I cry? What should I do? Finally, in the end, I didn't say anything. And she looked down at me and said, "Now, Victor, little trailer trash boy, you can't read this, can you?" I only had the courage just to look her directly in the eye and not say anything. But I did learn something that day. I learned that the world is full of people who are more than willing to take advantage of the weak, or at least those weaker than them. The other thing I learned was that I was trailer trash. Now, within a couple of years, I started to take that as a point of pride. Yeah, I'm trailer trash. What do you have to say about it? So, that's still my attitude. Vic Hermanson, trailer trash. Vic Hermanson, chronicler of trailer trash terrors.
Let me at her. Just let me at her. I'll murderlize her. I'll murderlize her 100,000 times. The current Vic Hermanson might be a buffoon, but I'm certain 6-year-old Vic Hermanson was innocent, bright, and probably quite cute. It does make one wonder what happened.
Let me at him! Let me at him! I'll get him, baby! Gangway, I'll brutalize him! Let me at him!
Go on a walk with me. Let's head down the main highway, staying just off the road enough where we're safe from the cars that are going by really fast. Let's walk past the general store. We won't even peek in to get a Coke with ice in it. Let's walk past the gas station with a big, huge gum machine. Put a nickel in that, get a big, huge gumball, and you hear this great sound. Let's walk past the library. There are books in there, at least a few, and it has a book smell. It's a good thing. Let's walk past what my mom calls the Holy Roller Church. I don't know anybody who goes there, but sometimes on Sunday morning I've gone out and I've listened to the hymns and I've listened to the people scream. Man, they're into it. Let's walk on down past all of that. We'll find a road that just leads out of town. It stays paved most of the way, and then it turns to gravel. Here, we find the house of Mr. Douglas Bowling. All of the kids call him Mr. Douglas. He's a nice man. He's a gentleman. He's a quiet man. He doesn't come into town very much. He's an attorney. He's a lawyer. He spends some of his time in Shreveport. He tends to take cases of people who are being pushed around. But most days, he sits on his porch, reads his law books, drinks his iced tea, looks out over the land, and I think he looks forward to one or more of the town children coming to talk to him. They like to talk to him because he has so many good stories, and he always takes time for them. He always wears a scarf, even on the hottest days. He walks with a limp and wears big round brown glasses. There's something wrong with his left hand, his left arm. It works. It just always sits there at kind of a strange angle. He has scars on his face. He always sort of looks down and tries to keep his face in the shade, but he can't hide them completely. He told us the story of the first and only circus that ever came to Mugwump, and how hard it was for them to find enough dry land to set up their tent. He told us about the bull shark that they caught in the Sabine River, and rode around town in the back of a truck, and everybody came to look at the big shark, and nobody seemed to have any idea where it came from. The boys kept swimming in the river anyway. Most of the time, he just talked about how beautiful the land was, and how much fun it was to be in that part of the world when he was a boy. He'd talk about legal concepts in the books. He would say things like habeas corpus, due process, the right to not self-incriminate. We had no idea what these words were. He was just a gentle man with a beautiful lilting voice and many scars in his face. One day, when we were sitting quietly on the porch, as always in Mugwump it was hot. You could hear the cicadas. And for some reason, out of the blue, I asked him how he got his scars, what was wrong with his left arm, why he limped. He looked down at me. I was sort of afraid. I thought that perhaps I had stepped over some line, that a boy shouldn't ask an adult such things. But he was gentle. He looked at me and said, "Well, that was the day my life changed. I was older than you. I was out with my dad. We were chopping wood, and something attacked me there in the woods. I smelled it a while before it attacked me. I heard noises off in the bush. It was a bad smell. And I heard noises that didn't sound like any other animal. And then the next thing I knew, this thing was on top of me, wailing and a-whooping at me, screaming at me, big teeth. It weren't no gorilla. The circuses and the papers said it was a gorilla. It even made the radio. I was in the hospital for a while. They thought I was going to die. I got an infection. I got an infection in the left side of my face. I got an infection in my ear. It broke ribs. I couldn't breathe. And I never did heal quite right. It took a long time before my dad could make it to where I wasn't just afraid all the time. I didn't have any idea what that thing was, but it weren't no gorilla, and it weren't no bear.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a WMWP newsflash. Escaped gorilla attacks and maims boy. Mugwump, Louisiana, December 14th, 1920. Terribly maimed by a wild animal, supposed to have been an escaped circus gorilla, the 15-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bowling of Mugwump, Louisiana, is unconscious at the home of his parents. The boy, with his father, earlier this morning was in the woods chopping wood. The boy some distance away from his father, when the father heard a terrible scream. Rushing to the boy, the father found him covered with blood and lying on the ground. The boy murmured something about a big animal, at least 7 feet tall, and who was stinking to high heaven. The boy sank into an unconscious state, from which unfortunately he has not yet been revived. It is thought that the beast may have escaped from a circus in Shreveport last summer, and which is supposed to have been roaming through the woods in this region. Another theory is that the animal was a bear, but no bear of this size has ever been reported in Louisiana.
The story that Mr. Douglas told me sent a chill down my spine. It scared me. It scared me a lot. But it wasn't a feeling I completely hated. He told me that I should probably stay out of the woods. Well, there was no possible way that I would stay out of the woods. I lived in those woods, and I was aware that I would see things sometimes back there. I never smelled anything that horrible. But I wasn't alone in the woods, and I knew it. He picked up a law book, an old one. He pulled out a yellowed piece of newspaper. It was crumbling around the edges. It was very old. But it told the story of how he had been attacked when he was just a child. I sat there and thought and thought and thought. And finally I said, "Mr. Douglas, what do you think all that means? Has that animal ever come back? Have you ever seen it again? Do you think it might follow you? Are you scared?" Then it was his turn. He thought long and hard, looked me in the eye and said, "My boy, he's out there. There are a bunch of them out there. I think they understand that I don't want to hurt them. And I think the one that hurt me was non compos mentis. That's a lawyer term. You'll know what it means someday. Well, I never did become a lawyer. I never did stay out of the woods. I did see some things in the woods sometimes that scared me a great deal. Things that scared the entire town. You can go back to last episode to listen to that. But I also never forgot his story. I didn't forget hundreds of stories that people in this town told me. How many of them were true? I don't know. Adults will lie to kids to keep them entertained. They'll lie to kids to keep them out of the woods. But I don't think Mr. Douglas was telling a falsehood. I think Mr. Douglas was talking to me about something that had been a true terror in his life. Now it's time for me to talk about a terror in my life. There's no question that this one is real. It has nothing to do with a mysterious animal in the woods. It has nothing to do with a ghost. It could indeed have something to do with demonic activity. And it certainly has something to do with minds that are not functioning quite properly. So, the final story of this episode is a place of perceived safety. I'll talk to you next week.
All right. I'll announce the title of tonight's story. You are indeed getting very lazy, Vic Hermanson. Ahem. Dramatic pause. Tonight's true tale of terror is titled, A Place of Perceived Safety.
My father, my dad, was rarely happier than when he was given charge of a new work truck. Initially, they were all similar, white with lockable toolboxes mounted on the sides, dual rear tires, usually Chevrolet, a long spotless bed, a huge bench seat, and floors covered in heavy textured gray vinyl. The new truck became his canvas, and he would walk around it for hours, planning where a crane might be mounted, the best way to build pipe racks, where the water cooler would go, how large a winch it needed, where he would mount his drop-down desk, or the best way to mount a heavy-duty triple ball and hook tow bar. Being insatiably curious, I would watch as he cogitated. He'd even ask me questions, for which, of course, I had no answer. "Hey, little bud, you think I ought to make a mud bag rack up there on top?" "Oh, yeah, Dad. You need to be able to put lots of mud bags up there." "Bars or perf behind the cab window?" "Oh, it's going to be perf for sure, Dad." I listened very carefully and could easily parrot the words. I enjoyed giving him my deep and comprehensive mechanical and truck build-out knowledge. He kept his entire life organized in yellow Leitz field books. When he died, we found hundreds of them, of which I've kept a few. As he planned how to finish his truck, he would diagram those plans in his yellow books. I'd sometimes ask him if I could see those drawings. When he would trust me with a book, seeing those drawings gave me an inner feeling of wholeness and order. I didn't know that my mind was innately hardwired to bring order out of disparate things. Over time, the truck would grow and change and attain a welcome and sometimes beautiful patina of splashed mud and gravel. Those diagrams in the yellow book became real. The toolboxes would fill with esoteric implements, and in a few weeks the truck was real, just as the Velveteen Rabbit became real from the love of an innocent child. But the outside of the truck wasn't the only part that changed. The cab, slowly, bit by bit, attained the smell. It was the remaining essence of Louisiana summer sweat, half-smoked cigars, old tins of Skoal, wet paper, sandwich wrappers, broken pencils, lingering farts, dried drilling mud, lubricating oil, gasoline, diesel, gunpowder, gun oil, Duke pomade, spilled beer, right guard, double mint gum, and whiskey. That combination might seem like a horrible miasma, but it really wasn't. Strangely, I mostly found it comforting, not because it was a pleasant smell, but because the cab itself could occasionally be a place of perceived safety. Occasionally, Dad would take me with him on various solo work tasks. We would drive deep into the countryside on gravel roads, sometimes across wooden bridges, and Dad would look for Loretta Lynn on the radio. He loved Loretta Lynn. I'd squint my eyes and fascinate myself with the sunlight filtering through the pine trees. Eventually, we would pull into a fenced field with a tall metal and concrete structure, a natural gas well, in the middle. He'd say, "You stay here by the truck." He'd walk to the well in his hard hat and overalls, turn several large valves, and unleash utter screaming hell upon the world. The sound of venting natural gas closely approximates a 747 on takeoff from atop one of the wings. With an adult mind, I estimate it was about 130 decibels. Dad was mere feet from the well and wore no hearing protection. This caused grievous hearing damage for the rest of his life. When that hellish sound came up on the land, I would scramble into the truck and burrow as deeply into the debris on the cab floor as I could. I'd grab old, oily drilling rags and stuff them into my ears as deeply as I could. That sound was terrifying. Once I decided that I was not going to die, I would peek out of the cab window and see a plume of freezing cold, due to rapid expansion, natural gas shooting high into the air. Still, with the logic of the child, I decided the truck cab was the safest place to be. He bled the well for about 2 minutes, then came back to the truck. He seemed amused to find me on the floor. Once, he took me with him to a crude oil storage yard. There were dozens of huge white storage tanks, filled with light, sweet Louisiana crude. Along the edge of the yard was a circular pit about 100 feet across and 50 feet deep or so. I believe it was where they collected contaminated crude oil and drilling chemicals. Dad took an old whiskey bottle, filled it with gasoline, and stuffed a drilling rag in the neck of the bottle. I had never heard the phrase Molotov cocktail. He lit the rag, walked close to the edge of the pit, and aimed the bottle using his left arm, as his right arm was withered from polio. I watched the arc of the bottle as it flew, heard it break against something solid, and watched, amazed, as what seemed to me to be the Holocaust of Sodom and Gomorrah was unleashed right before my eyes. In my little boy mind, I was seeing the very breath of Satan and hell itself. It seemed as if the flames would consume my small body, even from 50 yards away, and all other sound exited from the world. A fire like I never knew could exist erupted from the pit, drawing massive quantities of air into itself, releasing millions of BTUs, and sounding like a launching demonic rocket. The fire was at least twice the height of the storage tanks, probably rising to 120 feet in the air. The heat it generated made standing in that storage yard feel like standing in a huge oven. I saw Dad silhouetted against that fire and ran as fast as I could. I tried hiding behind one of the huge tanks to escape the heat, but to no avail. I saw the truck, ran to it, and hid on the floorboard, just as I did at the gas well. This time I cowered on the floor for at least 20 minutes, as the roar and heat of the fire slowly diminished. The air smelled of unidentifiable, noxious chemicals, but that only caused nausea, not existential fear. I'm pretty sure millions of brain cells met their demise from those fumes. Then there came the strange and mysterious day that the yard behind our trailer was filled with trucks, all driven by large, loud men. They emptied the truck beds of most of the various materials they carried, keeping only shovels, large hammers, pickaxes, chains, ropes, and other similar tools. I had no idea who these men were. They all had guns of some kind, mostly shotguns. They were drinking, and as they said in that part of the world, hootin' and hollerin' with great enthusiasm. The acrid smell of spilled beer and the sweet smell of whiskey were both thick and redolent in the air. I didn't have an internal understanding of a violent mob, yet I knew, somehow, these men were dangerous. I also knew my dad had become a very different man by being in their midst. He usually looked thoughtful even when he was angry. He was, after all, the owner of a brilliant mind. But this night, that look of reason, that of a natural Aristotelian, he usually carried, had been replaced with a look of long-delayed, but now required and deeply longed-for vengeance. That look scared me. I had no reference in my mind to place it in my pantheon of emotions. It was early afternoon when the men all started going to their trucks. My dad said, "Get in the truck, Vic." I was Vic then. "There's something we've got to do. No matter what, you stay in the truck." Heart pounding, deeply confused, aware that he was right at the edge of being dangerously drunk, I climbed in the truck. I do mean climbed. I was tiny, and these trucks were huge. I realized I was barefoot and asked Dad if I could get my shoes. He grew large, breathed deep, and growled, "We ain't got no time." I hated being barefoot. I felt vulnerable, and where we lived, there were hundreds of sharp cutting things to step on. But this day, there was no chance of having shoes, no matter where we were going. So, my job at this point was to figure out where we were going, what we were going to do, and how I should behave. Even at this age, my mind was a difference engine. I'd lay out all the known possibilities, tried to read the look on my father's face, listened to the big diesel engine, trying to see if it sounded like road driving or mud driving, looked to see if we were going toward or away from the sun, and most of all, most importantly, try to figure out the state of my dad's mind and heart. I've always been able to do that. There was no anger toward me, but there was a feeling emanating from him that made me profoundly sad, a feeling of helplessness. I knew we were doing something that he felt he must do. I was scared, but I was glad that whatever anger he felt wasn't directed toward me. But that could instantly change. Dad's right hand was withered from polio, but he would usually drive with his right wrist draped loosely over the wheel. He would hum a tuneless, tense song under his breath when he was nervous or tired. This day in the heavily scented truck cab, the humming was somewhat louder than usual, and certainly more dark and troubled. As we pulled onto the main highway, Highway 171, from the gravel and dirt road next to our trailer, he reached over and popped open the glove compartment. He could work the latch without using his thumb. The glove compartment was always full of receipts, little flashlights, ketchup packets, straws, manuals, but this time it also contained a gun, a blued revolver, with a wooden handle and a circular seal that said Astra. Yes, I could read. I had never seen Dad with a gun before. He looked at me and said, "It's a 680, as if that would clarify the situation, and slammed the compartment shut. The sudden, sharp sound made me jump. I wasn't afraid of the gun, per se, but it certainly made the whole situation more bizarre. Dad offered no explanation. I was angry at myself for not being able to figure out what was going on. I felt that my mind was somehow deficient. I'm not sure, in those days, if I fully realized I was a child. Seat belts were never a thing in my dad's trucks. I suppose they existed, at least the kind that went across one's lap, but I never wore them. Generally, I would stand up in the passenger seat, holding on to the strap above the door. I liked to feel my weight going around the corners and the automatic response of my muscles in staying upright. I imagined myself being massively strong. I liked the wind against my face and its roar in my ears. Standing up also allowed me to see where we were going and what was around me. All the trucks that had been in our yard were lined up together. I didn't know the word convoy, but that's what it was. 2 men were in the truck in front of us and 2 in the back. Whereas my dad seemed taciturn, these other men seemed jubilant. Occasionally a beer bottle would fly out of one of the truck windows. There were many beeping, blaring horns, and occasionally the trucks would change position in line. We drove for a long time in virtual silence. The sun was to my right, so we were going south. In perhaps 25 miles, we turned off the main highway and drove another 25 miles along progressively less developed roads, deep into the Louisiana forests. I usually love these country lanes. Some were little more than dusty trails with weeds in the middle, but there were surprises back there. Houses where people lived in lovely isolation, old wooden and steel bridges that crossed over deeply shaded streams, and it was always wonderful to see the strong Louisiana sun filter through the millions of huge pines. There was always a deep carpet of pine needles between the trees, a glowing, variegated natural painting as we drove, but I was too confused and scared to enjoy this beauty. The truck in front of us would occasionally veer to run over a mailbox or a gate post. The driver seemed to have a real love of weaving all over the narrow road. I asked Dad why he was doing that. "Ah, that's just Billy. He ain't no count." No further explanation was forthcoming. I mused over the words, "ain't no count," and wondered what they really meant. Finally, as the sun was scraping the top of the pines, we turned down a long, winding road with old metal hanging signs on each side. They were too rusted to read, but I could see a black cross inside a red shield was painted on one of the signs. As we drove, the pines grew thicker, and speckled forest darkness settled over us. The barely visible road opened into what had once been a clearing, but was now partially choked with weeds, short bushes, vines, and saplings. It was surrounded by an old wrought iron fence, only a few feet high, and deeply rusted, and no longer fully vertical. There were scores of headstones in a chaotic array, spread out in all directions. They were very old, covered in moss and lichens, leaning at all angles, and many of them had fallen and were now overgrown with weeds. There were some flowers fresh enough to still have color on a few of the graves. An ancient wooden building was in one corner. It had that gray, hopeless look that 100 years of sun and humidity brings. It had mostly fallen in on itself in a pathetic, moldering heap that had clearly once been beautiful. Men began to clamber out of their trucks, some holding shotguns, some holding pickaxes, sledgehammers, or shovels, some still clutching beer or whiskey bottles. I heard the imperative sound of my dad's voice. "You stay in the truck. I mean it now. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you stay in the truck. Got me? Understand?" Dad's voice was stern, low, serious, and more than a little drunk, but it was also concerned about me. Now I was really scared. That sound meant real possible danger. I remember at that moment focusing on the aroma of the cab, something familiar and heretofore safe. He never expected yes sir or no sir, so I just looked him in the eyes and nodded my head. He left the Astra in the truck. One moment there was the ticking sound of contracting metal, the calling of birds, and the sometimes deafening drone of cicadas. The audible effect was actually quite peaceful. The next moment there was a war cry, a sound of primal rage, coming from several dozen very large, very sweaty, very angry men wearing dirty work clothes. There was an exception in the clothing, as two men were in immaculate dark suits with shiny dress shoes and very thin ties. I'm not sure I knew, then, how to articulate the concept of horror, but that was clearly the emotion that arose within me. In a disorganized, headlong mass, they started the merciless destruction of the graveyard. Those stones still standing were toppled. Most were attacked with picks or hammers and soon reduced to rubble. Individual men seemed to meld into a collective, undulating, pulsing, and wantingly destructive organism. The cicada sound was now screaming, and its very nature changed. Where before there was just the sound of thousands of red-eyed insects seeking instinctively to propagate their species, now there was an overtone of agony and soulless rage, the sound of something infinitely removed from God. The crowd was moving like a hydra with dozens of heads, all focused on destroying something for no reason they could name. Occasionally, I would see a man's face halt in time, as if caught in the momentary flash of a strobe light. When that happened, the humanity in the revealed face was almost gone. In its place was a seething, malevolent, burning-eyed, demonic thing that could only be described as being joyously evil. I closed my eyes when I saw those faces and simply prayed for this nightmare to end. At one point during the orgy of destruction, a huge bearded man with more demonic glee in his eyes than most of the others noticed me, sitting in the truck. He stopped in his tracks and stared straight at me. He raised his sledgehammer high above his head and screamed, spitting as he did so, "Come and get some, little man. There's more than enough. Plenty for you. Come and break some shit. It don't get no better than this. In the distance, I heard my father say, "Chance, come help me with this big-ass stone." Chance looked at me one moment longer, seemed to lose interest, and went to help my dad. Occasionally, a man would find a stone he seemed to fancy for some reason or another. Then a few men would heft it into the bed of one of the trucks. Only a few of those made it into the trucks without breaking. One man attached a chain to the iron fence and ripped it from the ground with one of the 10-wheelers. He repeated this until the entire fence was a tangled, chaotic mass. 3 or 4 of the men were fanatically dedicated to shooting their weapons into the air, into trees, and even at a few of the gravestones. There was serious danger in that. I fell to my knees when the shooting started. It went on for a long time. I was crying. I didn't even know what I was crying for. But what else is a child to do? I could still see out of the truck, and most of the other trucks were now burning their headlights. Gasoline was poured over the old wooden chapel, and it was burned, flames leaping high and acrobatically, almost demonically, into the darkening sky. When all the graves from one area were smashed or loaded in the trucks, one of the men would further desecrate that by creating donuts with heavy truck tires and powerful engines. I heard one man scream, "Those fuckers are down, and they ain't coming back." I heard many ejaculations like this, mostly from the younger men. After the donuts were complete, several men would surround the destroyed area and urinate on the ground in an almost ritualistic manner. Most of the stones were simple, but there was one elegant, carefully carved stone in the shape of a Greek cross close to the now burning building. They carried it to one of the fully destroyed areas, laid it flat, broke off the cross extensions with sledgehammers, painted something on it, then stood over it triumphantly. One of the younger men, a huge fellow, both tall and massive, squatted over the broken stone and defecated on it. There was a resounding cheer at this action. "Shit, ain't got no paper." One of the other men threw him a dirty gray rag, and he also deposited that on the broken cross after its use. At some point I realized I had wet my pants. That was one of my common reactions to fear. When I would look into the crowd, my father would not allow me to catch his eyes. There would be a nanosecond of connection and then he was off. Eyes focused elsewhere. I saw him pick up a sledgehammer, swing it at a gravestone, one of the old damaged ones, and lose control of it. Goddamn polio, can't hold anything heavy. He absolutely could. Through muscle compensation, his left hand and arm were more than twice as strong as most men's single arms. He could easily hold a sledgehammer and swing it effectively with his one good arm. But he chose to present a fiction. My father had a complex face. He didn't have the look of savage, beatific joy that many, even most of the other men had. But instead, he had a look of grim, determined necessity. There was no smile. None of the salvaged stones were placed in the back of his truck. As the battle against the old graveyard neared its conclusion, some of the men began to paint words on the trees. There was too much glare for me to read those words, both from the headlights of the trucks and the thick tears in my eyes. I think I was grateful for that. There was no collective cry of victory, no announcement of mission completion, and hearty congratulations for a job well done. Nothing formal at all, saying the work of brothers in arms for the evening was over. If I stuck my head out of the truck, there was the mixed smell of freshly turned damp soil, burning wood, gunpowder, paint, gasoline, war sweat, urine, feces, and the limestone powder smell of pulverized stones. Finally, I returned to the floor of the cab, where the smells were familiar, not overpowering, and still fictionally safe. My entire body was vibrating, buzzing, almost to the point of being audible. Dad got back in the truck, started the big diesel engine, and just sat there, staring out the windshield, breathing heavily and loudly. His right hand trembled. "You okay down there on the floor, little bud?" I think I croaked, "Yeah, Daddy, I'm okay." I called him Daddy then. I looked up at his face. He wasn't biting his lower lip, as he always did when he was angry at me. I looked at that as a positive sign. He was sweating hard, saturating his shirt. There was heavy dirt embedded in the creases of his forehead. One of the other men pulled up beside us, facing the opposite way. "You driving with us? We're stopping at the gunny shack down the road a ways. Going to get some shrimp and beer." Dad thought a moment, tilting his head to the left, as was his habit. "No, I gotta feed my boy. I'll get him a sandwich and a Coke and Zwally. Company has a well out that way. I might check too." The man seemed momentarily disappointed, but finally smiled, said, "Suit yourself, Mr. Tool Pusher." Then he drove off. Dad looked down at me, assessed I was uninjured, and sniffed as if he could tell my pants were wet. Then we too drove away from what had once been a cemetery, back up the winding road, past the cross and shield signs, through the deep and fragrant southern woods, to the main highway, where the tires resumed their hypnotic whine. I was cold, though I can't imagine how, so I stayed on the cab floor. The drive was silent. I didn't know what I had witnessed, but I knew it was something evil, something fundamentally and irredeemably wrong. I also knew it was something we would never talk about, not ever, not even a word, so long as my father lived. I was right. I was painfully sad, sniffing quietly, ashamed because my pants were wet, and still feeling vulnerable because my feet were bare and dirty from the cab floor. Dad turned on the radio, and I heard, "On the wings of a snow-white dove, he sends his pure, sweet love, a sign from above." Then I knew nothing at all until the next morning, when I awoke on my padded shelf high above my sister's bed. After awakening, I ate something. Probably peanut butter on bread and chocolate milk. I was hungry. Dad had already left for the day. Not knowing what else to do, I retreated to the thickly carpeted forest floor and listened to the sounds of the woods, hoping beyond hope for them to be normal and to not include the painful, evil harmonic. The sounds were hot and loud and perfectly normal. I watched the sun move across the sky, through the thick pine boughs, until my mind no longer buzzed, and the feeling of red, painful shame faded from my face. That was a work of many, many hours. Okay, it's time for all the formal ending stuff. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson, with help from Boudreaux, of course. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. Our social media presence will be expanded in the next few weeks, but for now, if you want to get in touch with us, please just write to trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. We need your stories. As you can see, we are just a wee bit different here. If you have a story that you have thought is too odd to share anywhere else, please call us. Please send it to us. We want it, we need it, and we will present it with respect and understanding. Thanks again.
Vic Hermanson always takes all the credit. It's a human foible. This has been a CyberGhost production, copyright 2022. If you have listened to this entire podcast, you can apply for legal compensation through the law firm of Dewey Cheatham and Howe. Your application has a 0.000000001% chance of being approved, but you can apply if you like doing that sort of thing.
Well, you know what them egghead boys down at LSU say? They say, non-illegitimi carborundum. Bye, y'all.